Welcome back, everyone. After such a wonderful morning, we continue with our talks. And this panel is titled Asserting Authority, the Art of Lies, Idle Talk, and Trickery. We begin with Yulia Verkholantsev, who is topic director of the Wolfhumanities Center this year and the person who brought us together here today. She is Associate Professor of Russian and East European Studies here at Penn and founding director, and the founding director who essentially created the program in Global, Medieval, and Renaissance Studies. She specializes in medieval literature, linguistics, religion, and intellectual history, and has a particular focus on the small geographic space of Lithuania, Bohemia, Moravia, Poland, Croatia, Hungary, and Rus. Her first book, Ruthenica Bohemica, Ruthenian Translations from Czech in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland, analyzed how Czech Catholic sources were adapted to Orthodox Ruthenian milieu. And her second book, titled The Slavic Letters of St. Jerome, The History of the Legend and Its Legacy, or How the Translator of the Vulgate Became an Apostle to the Slavs, explored how the legend of the Slavic descent of St. Jerome was used by political and religious leaders from Rome to Bohemia and beyond for nearly 500 years until it was debunked in the 18th century as erroneous. She is currently working on her next book, Medieval Etymology and the Writing of History, which we will get a sneak peek at today.
Thank you, Ada. I was hiding behind the post because I was blushing for such a nice introduction. Thank you, Ada. Well, so now the secret is out. You know that I have short attention span in scholarship, so all my books are on totally different topics. But there's a lot of cohesion, methodological cohesion there. So my talk today is connected to a book project on the use of etymological methods in medieval and early modern historical writings, both in European Latinity and in traditions shaped by its historiographic approaches. This project also inspired the Truth topic, which is the annual topic of Wolfhumanities Center, since etymology literally means the discourse about truth, etymos meaning truth in Greek, and was understood as a truth-seeking method. As a historiographic tool, etymology lent itself to reconstructing the past through the interpretation of names, which supplied the plots of historical narratives. So for my book, I have gathered many such stories, but since the conference focuses on truth's rough edges, the ones I'll discuss today revolve around deception and trickery. Sorry, I should have practiced. Which one? Yeah, I pressed it. Oh, okay, now it worked. Sorry about that. So you're likely familiar with etymology as a modern discipline that traces the history of words. However, in the medieval and early modern periods, the principles of etymology were fundamentally different. While modern linguistics studies the history of words through genetic relationships and regular phonological changes, medieval etymologists prioritized uncovering original meanings, believing that language held hidden, inherent original knowledge about the world. In this philosophical approach, similarities between words were considered non-arbitrary and providential, with connections established purely on semantic grounds. This divergence in philosophical approach often leads modern readers to dismiss medieval etymologies as incorrect, their narratives as fictional and fantastical, rendering them irrelevant for historical analysis. I challenge this reductionist view and argue that etymological reasoning deserves our most serious attention. So there's a thread, we all come to this podium and it's like, we have to study this, we have to study this. So I feel like I'm repeating it. In my book, I examine sources spanning regions from England and the Frankish Kingdom to Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania, and propose a new framework for understanding the role of etymologizing and its significance. The practice of seeking explanations for the existing order of things in the literary and mythological past dates back to classical antiquity. Etymological thinking began as an intuitive linguistic response to reality and evolved into philosophical inquiry. In Greco-Roman thought, and especially in Christian providential historiography, etymologizing was used to uncover predestination, explain causation, and reconstruct the past, as seen in the works of authors such as Virgil, Varro, Ovid, Jerome, and Orosius. Christian hermeneutics added a mystical dimension to existing linguistic practice, charging the etymological analysis with the task of revealing hidden messages, prophecies, and truths, and providing etymologia with ultimate authority. A key milestone in this evolution is the work of Isidore, a bishop of Seville, an encyclopedist and historian, and his widely read etymologies or origins advanced the idea that history is rooted in grammar and language, and provided an example of how to think etymologically. This firmly established the etymological method across various fields of Latin scholarship, particularly historical writing. The authority of the etymological method in medieval historiography is strengthened by the Christian metaphysical narrative, which connects the act of creation with naming. Consequently, names, especially ancient names, hold unique historical significance because they contain what Isidore terms presagium, an innate prophetic knowledge of the past and future. Most of the first people, he says is not supposed to be part of the quote, sorry about that. Most of the first people, he says, derive the origin of their names from their own causes. To them, names were given in such a prophetic manner that they correspond either to their future or preceding causes. The notion that early humans possessed superior insight when coining names originates in Stoic philosophy and runs as a consistent thread throughout the history of etymological thought. As might be expected, the densest clusters of etymologies appear in the legendary sections of chronicles, where authors employ the etymological method to interpret ethnonyms, toponyms, and the names of historical figures in order to uncover the stories hidden behind them. While many of these narrative strategies drew on biblical and classical models, some stories derived from oral traditions, recounted as the wisdom of early sages. The etymological method then acted as the warrant of truth for these legends. Finally, a few words must be said about the relationship between names and their etymons, a relationship that medieval historians themselves recognized as fraught with difficulty. They were acutely aware of the effects of language change and understood that the shifting of sounds and forms posed a serious challenge to etymological interpretation. Chronicles often remarked that common people and foreigners alike struggled to understand and correctly pronounce original names, thereby introducing distortions and mispronunciations that altered their renderings. Yet, rather than abandoning etymological inquiry in the face of such obstacles, they treated these irregularities as puzzles to be solved. They believed that the superficial arbitrariness of linguistic change could be systematized and that the true meanings of names could still be recovered through the careful manipulation of letters. This practice, known as permutatio literarum, encompassed the subtraction, addition, transposition, and alteration of letters and syllables in order to expose hidden semantic connections and to reconstruct, as faithfully as possible, the original meanings. For example, Isidore derives the name for Langobards from the words for long and beard. The Langobards are commonly said to have been named for their beards, long and never cut. He provides two examples for the Franks. The Franks are thought to have been named after a certain chieftain of theirs. Others reckon that they were named for the brutality of their behavior, for their behavior is wild with a natural ferocity of spirit. So he derives it from the word feritas. These etymologies furnish historians both with authority and inspiration. The one derived from a certain duke is dramatized by the anonymous 7th century historian known as Fredegar, who recounts in his chronicle how the legendary Duke Francio led the Franks in their epic migration from Troy to their new homeland. The etymology from Veritas finds expression in the 8th century Liber Historiae Francorum, which tells how Emperor Valentinian bestowed the name Franci the Fierce in tribute to their daring spirit after they had aided him in driving the Alans, the evil Alans, from the Meotian swamp. And indeed, at the core of any etymological interpretation lies an implicit story, derived from the semantics of the etymon, sometimes left as a gloss or cited as a proof of an argument, but in certain instances taking on a more active role in shaping historical narratives. Today, I will focus on how the etymological method validated and informed several stories about legendary Polish dukes, who are portrayed as liars and tricksters. Their names appear in various forms as Lestik or Lestko, and this is in the background. You see it's a page from a manuscript of genealogy of Polish dukes, where the author of this codex was trying to make sense of various competing narratives, and he was graphically representing how these dukes are related to each other. So here you will see Lestko, two Lestkos going one after another, and those are the Lestkos that I'm going to talk about. So their name appear in various forms as Lestik or Lestko, and in modern Polish, Leszek or Leszko, and derive from the word leszcz, pronounced in Old Polish something like lest, so like really very close to lest, lestko, which carries connotations of pretense, trickery, stratagem, deception, and falsity. I will argue that backed by the authority and truth-bearing force of etymology, the acts of deception and trickery attributed to rulers bearing this name were perceived as predestined and inherent. Moreover, the etymological framework not only furnished motives for narratives of deception, but also ensured that the stories continued to circulate in Polish historiographic tradition, despite their somewhat unflattering portrayal of royal ancestors. A ruler named Lestik first appears in the 12th century Gesta Principum Polanorum by an anonymous author commonly referred to as Gallus Anonymus, on account of his presumed origin from Gaul. Lestik is presented as the grandfather of the first historical Duke Meshko and the grandson of the legendary protoplast, the farmer Pazd, the founder of the Piast dynasty, which ruled Poland until the second half of the 14th century. As a non-native speaker of Polish, Gallus resorts to etymologies only occasionally, mostly when a local tradition of interpretation already exists. He does not interpret Lestik's name, and no narratives of deception appear in his account of legendary history. Such narratives begin with the chronicle of Master Vincent Kadłubek, who was a native Pole and could very easily manipulate and play with the language. He structures his account rather originally for a chronicle as a Socratic cross-examination between two learned scholars. Taking turns, they recount the history of the Poles, drawing on oral tradition while testing it against authoritative sources and etymologies that confirm its veracity. Like other historians of his time, Vincent situates the antiquity of Polonia within what was known from Greek and Roman authors about the distant past. His narrative, therefore, reaches back to the times of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. The military conquests of Alexander the Great were a recognized episode in the history of ancient societies, and consequently a helpful reference point for the history of the Poles. Since no source mentions the defeat of the Poles, Vincent concludes that they were never defeated and imagined how an encounter between Alexander and victorious Poles might have unfolded. Military deception is a conventional explanation for the triumph of an army outnumbered and overpowered by its enemy, as Alexander's formidable forces would have been in relation to the Poles. And it is hardly surprising that Vincent adopted this plot, since the name of the legendary Lesko offered a fitting and plausible framework for such a narrative. When Alexander the Great demands tribute from and this is the story. When Alexander the Great demands tribute from the free-spirited Poles, they kill his envoys and refuse to submit. Alexander then marches into Polonia with an innumerable army. He devastates the provinces of Krakow and Silesia, leveling centuries-old walls to the ground, reducing everything into ashes, and ordering the conquered land to be sown with salt. So those are all recognized topoi from classical historiography. But when all hope seems lost, a clever fellow, someone gifted in the goldsmith art, devises a multi-stage stratagem to defeat Alexander's army of invincible silver shields. He orders helmets and shields made of wood and cork tree, painted them with litharge and yellow paint to resemble silver and gold, and sets them on a hilltop where the sun makes them shine. The illusion of a large army in full combat readiness throws Alexander's troops in disarray. They lose order and scatter. The Poles seize them, strip their real silver armor, and don it themselves. Disguised as Alexander's victorious soldiers, they infiltrate his camp and fall upon the remaining unarmed troops. Realizing the ruse, Alexander flees with only a handful of forces. Lesko, the master of the stratagem, is then elected king of the Poles. A poor but intelligent smith who outsmarts a powerful opponent is a recurring motif in world literature and oral traditions, as is the trickster figure in general. Many details and even the phrasing of Vincent's story are borrowed from ancient authors, whom he quotes in order to embed his account within the classicizing meta-narrative. Vincent conveys several subtle messages through rhetorical and linguistic allusions, which I do not have time to address here. But the central theme of deception, however, is driven above all by the idea of dexterity, craft, and cunning, etymologically expressed in the protagonist's name. He was called Lesko, that is, astute, because he defeated more enemies with astuteness than force. And the Latin words that is used here, astutus and astus. Beyond enacting the semantics of the name, Vincent's narrative serves another, more conceptual purpose, to illustrate that the election of a king should rest on merit. This arises less from the notion of fraud and deceit than from the story of a clever stratagem. The Latin term astutus that Vincent employs conveys a wide semantic range from clever, shrewd, expert, sly, cunning, artful, often with a positive connotation. And importantly, the term astus is also found in both classical and medieval sources with a sense of a military trick or stratagem. Lesko's name thus obliges him to perform a deed of astuteness appropriate to his role as a future king, which Vincent duly provides in the story of his military stratagem. After Lesko I, Vincent tells the story of another ruler of the same name, Lesko II, though he notes that this one was so called for a different reason. He didn't elaborate. Lesko I left no children at his death, and deprived of a king, and after much debate about who should ascend the throne, the most illustrious among the Poles, much as in stories from classical antiquity, decide to hold a horse race to determine who would obtain the crown. The race, however, is marred by deceit. While most were putting their trust in a proven skill of swiftness, one individual relied on the secret craftiness of his wit, aided by the Vulcan's art. This cunning fellow covered the entire racetrack with iron spikes, leaving only a narrow path known to him, so that while others were hindered, he alone could reach the finish line first and seize the prize. Clever, huh? It is noteworthy that, whether by coincidence or design, Vincent again links the trick with the smithy, as suggested by the figure of Vulcan, the god of smithcraft. But as Vincent observes, deceit and even the craft of deceit is defeated by a craftier deceit. This time he uses another term for his interpretation, dolus, which carries the meanings of trick, device, deceit, treachery, trickery, cunning, and fraud, and bears a more negative connotation than astus. Vincent then continues with the story of a still craftier deceit. At the time when the royal contest was being planned, two young men of the lowest rank were holding a foot race of their own. As a joke, they resolved to stage it on the very field where the battle for the kingdom is being fought. There, they quickly discovered the spikes and the narrow path the cunning fellow had prepared, and they too covered it with spikes. So now there's no path, there are only spikes on the field. No one can win. Yet, as Vincent writes, vanity awoke in them both, and each secretly devised their own plan. When the day of the competition arrived, the original cheater, the master of the scam, ran into the spikes along with the rest of the contestants. One of the young men, the one who discovered the trick, the day before, shot his horse with iron, rode swiftly to the finish line, and was proclaimed king. The other one ran across the field on foot by a long roundabout route, being mocked by the crowd, and reached the finish line second. But when the assembly discovered the shot horse, they declared its rider the master of the deceit and ordered him torn to pieces. The other youth, the one who took the roundabout route, who came second, was by judgment of the authorities made king. Now let's analyze the appropriateness of Leska's name. Vincent merely notes that Leska bore the same name as that Leska II bore the same name as Leska I, but for a different reason. Yet there's a tension in the logic of his narrative. Whereas Leska I is clearly a trickster and an author of a stratagem, Leska II is neither a deceiver nor even the master of the iron spike trick. Rather, he is someone who happens to be in the right place at the right time and clever enough to seize the opportunity. Because of his poverty, he cannot afford a horse, so he competes on foot. And while the horsemen are hindered, he is able to advance. If, however, Leska's name is inherent, we should expect to see this embodied in the story itself. Yet in Vincent's account, the connection between the name and the deed remains vague, at least not explicitly stated. The anonymous author of the early 14th century Chronica Polonia Majora, who recounts Vincent's legendary stories, has more to say about the appropriateness of the name bestowed on the new king. To resolve ambiguity, he adjusts the narrative. In his version, when the deceived contestants discover the horse shod with iron, they call its rider Lestko explicitly because he is deceitful. The author uses the qualifier dolosus, so the one with little negative connotation, crafty, cunning, deceitful. When the fraudster is punished, however, his successor, the youth who won the race on foot, receives his name. As he writes, and he was called Leska II after the name of Leska, who had been delivered into punishment. So Leska II thus inherits a name that commemorates deceit, yet also bears witness to the justice of its defeat. Though his very name is tied to the art of trickery committed by his rival, He himself is cast as a noble, virtuous, and modest ruler. Most strikingly, he never ceases to acknowledge his humble origins, an attitude held up as not only compatible with, but even enhancing royal dignity. Jan Długosz, rewriting Poland's legendary history in the 15th century for his annals, also recognized the tension in the narrative, whereby the original trickster escapes punishment, while only the opportunist is condemned. Remember, there were like really two people who messed it up, and only one gets punished, so not good. To resolve this contradiction, Długosz reshapes the tale to erase the inconsistency altogether. He dismisses one of the youths who had discovered the spikes, leaving only the future king, and in his retelling, the original master of the iron spike trick seeks to profit from deceit and suffers the punishment he deserves. By contrast, the youth who wins the contest on foot does so playfully, with no genuine desire for power. Długosz heightens the irony with a citation from Ecclesiastes: many have taken, quote, many have taken seat upon the throne, yet he that was unsuspected shall bear the crown. Conclusion. Both accounts of Lesko I and Lesko II draw on classical rhetorical models and reflect mythological influences from oral tradition. The etymological interpretation of their names, which introduces the motive of deception, operates both as the engine of the narrative and as the seal of validation that binds its broader logic, compelling authors to reshape their stories in accordance with the meaning revealed by the etymology. Within this framework, trickery itself remains ambivalent. Its social acceptance hinges not on the act itself, but on the character of the deceit and the moral grounds invoked to justify it. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you, such rich material. And so I have questions for each of you that are totally oblique to the presentations you gave, but relevant to the topics. So I apologize in advance, but I'd love to hear what you think. So to Pavel, I have always been interested in the fact that Jesuits came disproportionately from the population of conversos in Spain, and have wondered, as have others, whether one of two possibilities exist: whether the Jesuit art of casuistry is possibly related to Pilpul, to the Talmudic casuistry, and the other thing is what has been claimed of Jews, conversos, which is mental reservation in the, let's say, in the Kol Nidre prayer of Yom Kippur. That's my question for Pavel. For Oscar, this is really even more oblique, but also examples from Jewish history. I'm wondering if in your work on gossip, you have given any thought to the centrality of gossip in inquisition, in labeling Jews or conversos, or let's say conversos, moranos, what we used to say, as they become targets of inquisition. Gossip is central to that. The other thing that I don't know if you're aware of it, and it may be historically not a lead, but there's a very rich tradition of really both witty and virulent invective poetry in Hebrew, both in medieval Spain and in Provence. So I don't know if that's relevant. This is to Julia. Your earliest source is Isidore, but obviously on etymologies, but the Bible is filled with etymological puns, and the name, Moses is named Moses, Kim Moshe, Kim Kiminha Mayim Mishitihu, right? And other examples. There Boaz, there Noach, all these people, their names are plays on who they are. And there are even within the Bible, I had to look it up, but there's a phrase in Isaiah, which I wrote down, sorry, Pachad v'fachat v'fach alecha yoshev haaretz, right? That the terror, the pit, and the trap are upon you. So it's known biblically, and of course, the use of acronyms and substitution of letters is not only widely used by rabbis and subsequent Jewish commentators, interpreters, but it also is directly related to the Greek, as at least two of the names, Gematria and Kon, indicate. So my question is, was Isidore aware of the fact that both the Bible and Hellenistic tradition prior to him had a lot to, played a lot with etymologies?
Yeah, thank you very much, Talia. These are two questions, really, right? The one is about the Jewish background of the converso background of the Jesuit, and indeed, around Loyola, there are quite a few people of converso background, and some of the very prominent Jesuits during the Council of Trent have the converso background. At some point, they actually ban people of Jewish origins from joining the Jesuit order. And it's in part in response to the Dominican accusation of the Jesuits being the Jewish order, right? So it is. You have it there. I don't know, but I don't think this kind of stuff goes up into the 18th century, right? So we are many years later in a completely different milieu. I am not aware of anyone making a comparison between the Jesuit casuistry and the Pilpul. And again, Pilpul has nothing to do with conversos, right? This is an Ashkenazi tradition. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Talia, for also, I guess, two questions. The first one about the labeling. So in the period or sources I was working on right now, there are not much really about Jews. I think mostly because they were not necessarily part of this educated elite. It's true that if I want to expand this larger to the Mediterranean, I should be thinking about that. Particularly, I might get like gossip about Judaizantes. That would be a way to talk about people who were converts, but they returned to that. I think kind of contemporary to this, I think of Luis de Carvajal would be kind of the most iconic case. But I think, interestingly enough, I think this points to an interesting question about how gossip is related to kind of a specific political and social preoccupations of the time. So in the case of the Ottomans, for example, the period I'm working on, right 50 years before, most of the gossip was about Christians who had converted, and very similarly to what would happen to people accused of being Judaizantes in Spain or in New Spain, were being accused of being secretly Christian and helping other Christians, and that would be used to attack them. By the period that I was presenting here today, this has kind of already moved on, and is more kind of a discussion about education or about morality, about how they can, go and try to sleep with a young boy or things like that they're suddenly kind of talking about. So I think it's interesting, and as I say, I think maybe the larger project is actually for the whole Mediterranean, at least for now. So I think I will have to incorporate a bit of that later. In terms of inventive poetry, thank you. I didn't think about the Hebrew part of it. It is common in Ottoman, at the very least in this moment. it's very little studied. Actually, there are only a couple of things, one PhD thesis and a couple of articles that have been done on it. And interestingly enough, has always been done only in relation to literature. So it would be interesting to think through it as how people use them, not only like the metaphors or things they use, but actually the impact it had in some of these people. And it was, I think, similarly common in Ottomans as it might have been in medieval Spain for Hebrew case. But I'll look into that. Thank you, Talia, as always.
Well, thank you, Talia. Yeah, I can always count on you to engage with my research. I was just checking my references here. So I had to rush through the first part because I was anxious to get to liars. So the truth part was not. And, you know, it's very difficult to do justice to the whole history of the etymological thinking because so much has been written about that. And the first part of my book will be connected with that. Not that much about the etymology itself, because as I said, so much has been written, but showing how it actually entered the history writing as a method of epistemology and not just as it was used anywhere else. So I was just checking, actually my first reference is to Virgil, because I really jump over that, and I think here I go Virgil, Varro, Ovid, Jerome, and Orosius. But you know, I should have, of course, put the Cratylus and Plato, and I think I mentioned Stoics. So it's really even before. So into Christian scholarship, it does get through the Judeo-Christian discourse, but also through like kind of from different directions, and. Obviously, I think I also mentioned something about the act of creation through naming. So there are a lot of and Christian providential historiography. So, you know, obviously the biblical naming is all a part of the scholarship. And now the question to Isidore, of course, he was aware of that. He was, you know, as we know, Isidore didn't make up, you know, he didn't invent anything original. He was just capitalizing on all the wisdom that was created and written before him. So obviously he was working off Augustine, of Orosius, of other Christian thinkers, early Christian thinkers, Jerome. So yes.
Julia, thank you for exposing me to Leshko. Now, is Lech Walesha, is that a derivative of Lesko? How did Lech? And if you had a son in Poland now, would you name him Lesko if you had aspirations, or would you name him Lech?
So funny that you ask. So everybody knows Lech, and in fact, Lech is the forefather of the Poles. And at some point, he was connected, although through Lesko. So the Leskos were first to enter the deception rhetoric. And then, retrospectively, they were analyzed as diminutive of Lech, even though it's not true. We would not think of that as Długosz, in fact, and this is the quote I had to cut because I was already going over the time limit that I myself imposed on the talks. So, but what Długosz says, and again, very grateful for the question, so I can bring it into this, is that Lech is indeed connected to this etymology. And what he does, and this is the point in my talk that I was trying to make, is that the narratives and the change in the narrative tries to adjust to the etymology to make it the most explicit. So he changes the narrative about I would have to tell you a legend. So there's an old, I'll be very quick. There's an old legend about the dragon in Krakow who was terrorizing the city, and there was a Krak who had two sons. He also recognizable stories. So he sends his sons to fight the dragon, and then the oldest son kills the dragon, but then the youngest son, kind of Cain and Abel model, so he kills the old son and claims the credit. So the original story doesn't give the names to these people, and only then the second, so Vincent, I think, calls the younger Krak, because he then inherits the throne. But Długosz, who was aware of the etymology of Lech, so he switches the name, and he actually calls the younger Lech because of the connection of the name to the deception and to the the idea of lying. So they were trying to, once the narrative of lying and this connection of the name with the lying entered the narrative, so they were trying already to kind of rearrange the narratives to make it fit to the etymology, because just the etymology was one of the only proofs, the scholarly proof of the veracity of the stories that they were just making up.
Well,
Sorry for the long
I have a question
answer.
for Oscar. So the dangers of gossip are clear because of the beheadings you described. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the timescape of this stuff. So, if I'm writing a book of pleasantries, do I take the risk and do it in kind of like right when the Sultan has beheaded someone erroneously? Or is there a bit of, in other words, like, are these, it's hard to imagine them being contemporaneous. And if they are, I'd love to hear why. And if they're not, kind of what is the time? And then why is that gossip still valuable if there's a time separation?
So I think so it's a bit difficult to date, because most of the manuscripts that we have so the one I was talking about, the Latife, is added to the manuscript of the complete poems, and most of these manuscripts are put together afterwards, and they're not dated. There's not always a way to date them. I think the written, and that is kind of interesting, because I think it points out to the oral aspect of it. So most of these stories actually circulated in the period, and they had the relevance because they were orally reproduced, and then people will hear them, and then it's much later that they start mentioning here and there. Sati is a particular anomalous case, and I think that's why it deserves kind of a special study, because he puts it together, it's part of his divan, and other people mention it at the same time. I think partly is because he is not mentioning anyone with particular political power. He's not talking about the Sultan, he's not talking about a general, he's talking about kind of his enemies. So in that way, he's kind of able to use that in order to position himself within the city. Some of the other ones are actually compiled post facto, and I think it's partly, for example, the other case I mentioned is compiled by the son of this person, and I think the son probably was also trying to make sure that his father's reputation is kind of continuous, right? And so he had, my father was like such a scholar, he had these type of stories, they're used in this way. So in that way, I think it has two values. First, when the stories were circulating, and then later when someone decided to put them together to maybe show that continuity between him and his father in this case. I know that answers the question a little bit.
It does. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also have a question to Professor Aguirre Mandujano. Hopefully I pronounced it correctly.
Oscar is fine.
It's very exciting how you focus on pleasantry as a practice, moreover as oral practice versus genre and canon. But I was wondering if these motifs reproduce in other media, such as, for example, caricatures that you have in oral pleasantry, if they travel to other media, visual, for example.
No, not that I'm aware of, at least not for this period. So most of these manuscripts would not have illustration, and actually the ones that we have illustrations are much later. when they were already kind of famous works, and then someone will make them, and then but because it was very expensive, right? So they would put a lot of money to make them with illustrations, but not for the pleasantries. So they actually remain kind of almost like a, you know, as I was saying, like it's almost secondary to these other genres. But you do have the stories showing up in other texts, even if not in a different media. So as I said, some of the stories trickle down into biographical dictionaries, into histories, into chronicles, into poems, or you just have the poem that was accompanied, that used to be together with the joke. They used to write usually like a little poem to kind of add flavor to it. And that poem might appear somewhere else. So there was definitely some sort of circulation, but most of it was oral. And I think part of it will have to do with the fact that you wouldn't depict anything like that at the time, I don't think. But thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Professor Majeko, could you please explain a little bit more about the art of lying and what Ayako actually learned from the Jesuits? And was he a good student?
I don't know if he was a good student, but yes, basically, you see, the point is this, right? Normative Judaism, unlike normative Christianity, allows lying. In other words, if in the Talmud you have debates about the fact whether there are situations in which a moral person is allowed to lie, and their answer is very clear: yes, there are such situations. If you can't save innocent lives by lying, you should lie. There are more examples, right? If on the day of her wedding, if your daughter is coming to you and asking, "Dad, how do I look?" and she's not looking great. The rabbinic position is you are obliged. You're not only allowed, you are obliged to tell her that she is, in fact, looking great. So the rabbinic Judaism is clearly telling you there are situations in which lying is kosher. The Christianity, in contrast, Augustine takes this super radical position and says no lying ever. Right? There are no circumstances in which you are allowed to lie. And again, there is an internal debate in Christianity about it, but the tenor of the opinion, especially in the early modern period, is this Augustinian position. Christians are not allowed to lie, ever. Now, Augustine is defining lying as making false statements with intention to deceive, right? So there are two elements. The statement has to be false, and you have to have an intention to deceive other people. If you accept Augustinian position, you are not allowed to lie, and you want to find a workaround, you have to work with one of those two elements, right? In other words, you have to find a way to deceive people while making true statements, or you have to somehow work with the concept of intention that allows you to make false statements without the intention of making false statements. Which is why, right, Christian moral theology and later also jurisprudence develops techniques of doing this, right? How you deceive people while making statements that are actually, in some sense, true statements, which are those two Jesuit techniques that I mentioned, right? The verbal equivocation and mental reservation. There are other techniques. There is something that's called the evasion of mind. There's more, right? But essentially, those are techniques that allow you to lie without lying, right? To deceive other people while making statements that are in some sense true, either working with the ambiguity and multiple meanings, or working with all kinds of mental devices that allow you to preserve it. Essentially, what I am arguing is, all right, Judaism does not have this kind of techniques because it doesn't need to have this kind of techniques, because in a similar situation, you can just lie. Right? Now, what I am saying is Ayako is using the techniques that are clearly Christian techniques in order to defend himself from accusations of heresy.
And he learned that from the Jesuits?
This is the argument, yes.
So Yulia has a question.
I think before me.
Oh, sorry, I didn't say.
No, go ahead. First, I have to respect.
If you're sure. I know we are starting to run out of time, but during lunch I finally had the chance to look at a wonderful exhibit of the rare books and manuscripts. And I really truly think it's one of our superpowers at Penn, that the Wolf Humanities Center can work so closely with the library, its holdings, materials, and also wonderful curators like Nick Harmon who pulled together this exhibit. So I just wanted to invite, if any of you have thoughts on the material that you have either chosen or were chosen by the library to sort of represent areas of your expertise, because I know they'll be still out at the reception, and some of us would love to be able to connect what you spoke about with the material. I have the list here if you'd like to take a look.
So I'll just take responsibility while the guys are thinking. So unfortunately, we have a lot of strengths. We're not very strong in Polish history, so there's nothing on that. But there's a wonderful copy of Isidore's Etymologies, which even has some illumination, so I invite you to peruse it. I think there's something else, Nick, like I really didn't have time to think about. Do you know what you want to say? No? I think they said that they don't know, so that's why I'm just filling in the time.
They're really fascinating array of things.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
yeah.
may I speak for other panelists? So actually, there's a lot of materials, and I invite you to use the time at the reception to examine the manuscripts. There's wonderful books, like all the heads that Ellie was talking about, that we have manuscripts on that. Wonderful materials on the early history of navigation. Cryptography, like wonderful manuscripts of cryptography, a lot of diagrams. I'm forgetting chronicles, illustrated chronicles. Yes, exactly. This, these heads. Also, next session when Zoya Opacic and Emily Steiner are going to talk about materials related to their talk, the scrolls, the historiographic materials, the illustrations of imaginary cities. So a lot of material that directly relates to our conversations here. And, I don't have to ask a
Yeah,
question.
I think that's a great place to stop so everybody can stretch their legs and feel fresh. We start again in 9 minutes, so use your time well.